How you doing, guys? Eric from worldwasteland.com. I have ranted pretty extensively on this channel about how, major the impacts would be on the United States and the economy if/when will be any sort of major escalation in the tensions between China and Taiwan specifically. But also, this could apply to just escalations of World War III in general. But specifically when it comes to China and Taiwan, the U.S. is so dependent on Southeast Asian and specifically Chinese manufacturing for so many elements of our economy, everything we do on a day-to-day basis, that I don't think people even realize it. Like, people know, yeah, we get a lot of stuff from China, but I don't think people realize what extent that's true. I've talked before about how, China produces something like 90% of generic antibiotics, a huge portion of small consumer electronics and computers and things like that, stuff like tires, massive amounts of textiles and everything. So, and just the random small chemicals that may be in something, that's one of the elements that people don't think about, is that if something could be 90 or even 95% made and manufactured in the United States, but if one of those things that it needs in any part of the process comes, 90 or 100% from overseas, that will stop everything in its tracks. Something like preservative chemicals. Those are made a lot overseas. A company isn't just going to ship the stuff out with a different formulation that wouldn't even be legal. They would have to change their labels, they would change the storage and transportation requirements. So if they don't get a shipment of a preservative, some random food, which, that food, the ingredients for that food may be made 100% in the US, but if one random chemical or one random ink for the label or anything like that, a plastic lid, that will stop the whole process. And, in an absolute emergency, like starvation, whole entire country starvation level, that stuff would just get pushed out. But it would take that to overcome it. And up to that point, there'll be a lot of disruptions like we saw, with COVID early on. And something like, the missing component like that stops the supply line for 5 days to 2 weeks or whatever, which would be pretty trivial considering that level of disruption, that stores will be gone. I mean, the inventory of that item in stores will be wiped out, because we know that there's only usually 24 to 72 hours of supply of anything in stores at any given time. But, most of us don't have enough money to just stock up on every potential thing that we need or we know will become more valuable in the event of something happening with Taiwan and China. But we also, people who watch this channel are probably going to be a little more savvy about what's going on. They'll probably have a good opportunity to be first to act. And the old saying always goes, you have to either be better, be first, or cheat. In this case, I think we can be first. And there's a lot of things that we could snap up within that 24 to 72 hour window that we know are going to disappear or become way more valuable in the event that something's announced, like a blockade on Taiwan. We know that this stuff is it probably won't even, probably take a few days for most normies to realize, and for supplies of something to be drained. So we could have an opportunity to buy that stuff up. But what should you buy? You don't just want to run out and buy a bunch of random things that you think may become more valuable. First step is obviously anything that you personally need and you personally use. Those are the no-brainers. Regardless of whether you think it's is actually made in China or not, that's another one of the cascading effects. You may say, oh, well, the blank I use isn't made in China, but if all the ones that are made in China disappear, all the people who were buying that will now have only a few remaining options, like the ones that are made here, which you may be buying. So those will disappear as well. So it will have a cascading effect. So definitely stock up on stuff that you use and that you need, regardless of what you think its origins are in terms of manufacturing, because everything will be affected. Beyond the things that you already know that you use and need, there's things that you might potentially need in the future, like the medicines that I've talked about, and things that may become much more valuable as a barter or even something you could flip. And those are the items that I'm going to talk about today. And there's a couple things you have to keep in mind. There's I think four or five kind of attributes that you would want to look at to see if something's worth spending money on to snap it up. The first one is obviously the things that are, even though I do think everything will be affected, the most affected will be the things that are massively imported. So check to see, we're trying to find items that, number one, are mostly imported, or at least major components of them or critical components of them are mostly imported. Like we're talking 75 to 100% imported specifically from China. That applies to a lot of stuff, so I'm not going to necessarily name everything, but look around. You know, if you have something you think fits the bill for snapping up last minute in the event of a blockade on Taiwan or something that may go way up in value. First thing to check is this thing or any component of it massively imported from China? Second is an inelastic demand. So inelastic demand means the demand does not change much even if the price rises. So certain things that are, you know, luxury goods are going to, you know, people just stop buying them. If it's not something they need, you know, then if the price goes way up, people are going to just buy it a lot less. Whereas something like, let's say, gasoline, most people are going to have a certain amount of gas usage no matter what the cost is. Unless it gets something absurd where they literally can't afford it and have to transform your entire life, people are going to pay 5, 10, 15 bucks a gallon and there's a certain amount that they're just going to have to use. So that's what an inelastic demand is. And some things can have an inelastic demand simply because their overall dollar amount is small. If something's $1, you know, the demand's not going to change much when it goes up to $3, $4, simply because that's just not that expensive still. So, and one example of something that is massively imported but doesn't really have an inelastic demand would be most articles of clothing, like textiles and stuff. Almost all of that manufacturing is done overseas. We make a lot of the raw materials like the cotton and stuff, but we don't really make a lot of clothing here. A lot of that's done in Southeast Asia. But most people don't need anywhere near the amount of clothing that they're buying. Most clothing that people buy is for, you know, vanity style, you know, personal enjoyment reasons and not literally because they need more clothing. If people were, you know, dropped to a level where they were only going to buy clothing that they need when the previous item they had wore out, there would be very, very little spending on clothing. So even though clothing definitely fits the bill in terms of a massive amount of it is manufactured overseas and imported, I don't think it meets the inelastic demand. If prices of t-shirts quadrupled, people aren't going to buy nearly as many, especially like graphic ones. They just don't need them. And a pair of jeans people could use for a few years without buying a new one most of the time. I tend to wear out the crotch in mine, so if you have thunder thighs that rub together, you know, maybe they can't last years, but so make sure it fits every element. So it has to be imported, but also has to have an inelastic demand. The next element is it has to be relatively small and inexpensive. I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be inexpensive, but the more expensive something is, automatically you're already narrowing its field. So something like tires, for example, massively imported, have a pretty inelastic demand. People, if you need a tire, you need a tire. You're not going anywhere without it. But it's not small and inexpensive. They're really big. They're relatively expensive each. So you can't really go out and buy a bunch of tires, you know, last minute and then hope to be able to sell them. The shipping's going to ruin you. Storage takes a lot of space. They're heavy. So they're not a good candidate, even though they meet all the previous requirements of an inelastic demand and a high import percentage. Next one is shelf stable. Obviously, just like the tires and the storage, if you have something that would need to be, I can't even think of anything off the top of my head, but anything that just doesn't last very long or would need special storage conditions like refrigeration, not a good candidate because that's going to have all sorts of costs associated with that as well. So, like I said, I can't think of any specific example for that, but avoid anything that's going to be difficult to store or doesn't store long term. The last requirement that I think you should look for is that it's fungible, meaning that each one of them is basically the same. So just like going back to the tire example, another problem with tires and other car parts and like repair parts that would be a good candidate otherwise because they meet everything else is that there's going to be a bunch of different variations that people can't use. They need their very specific variation. So regardless of how badly you might need a tire, if it's not the right size for your wheel, you can't use it. And that goes for a lot of different repair parts as well that, you know, probably have a huge percent being imported, are inelastic demand, relatively small and cheap repair part. If it's something that needs to be specific, then you're going to be out of luck unless you find someone who needs that exact same part. So stick with something that's more fungible, that is all of them are the same, and you're going to have a lot better time finding someone to trade with or to sell it to, or a lot better time using it yourself. Okay, so we've gone long enough. What are some items that meet all 5 of these requirements? Obviously, the first one that I always mention in these videos is antibiotics. Firstly, because of how important they can be if you don't have them. Quit farting around. Get your Jace case. Link will be in the description. Antibiotics meet all the requirements. Obviously, like I said, they're mostly imported. They have a very, very inelastic demand. If you find out you need antibiotics, you need them. Like, the price is not an object at that point. Like, you will pay thousands of dollars for what are now $50 worth of antibiotics if it comes to that point. And so that's obviously massive, massive potential for trade and barter, but also means it's very important for you personally. So I definitely recommend having them for yourself. Link will be in the description. And yeah, like I said, they meet all the other requirements. They're small, relatively inexpensive now. This is only like $200 for a bunch of courses of antibiotics. Shelf stable for years, and relatively fungible. Like, there's different types of antibiotics, but any one jar of amoxicillin is going to be the same as any other jar of amoxicillin. There's not a million different variations. And while we're on the same topic, another one is just random over-the-counter meds. Another things like ibuprofen and acetaminophen, can't even speak today, also majorly imported. Pretty much if you can look online and there's like an Amazon Basics version of it, which is like Amazon's, just their brand, that's all manufactured in China pretty much. So anything that has like an Amazon Basics is a good place to start to see if that would meet all these requirements. But this pretty much hits all the same elements as the antibiotics, with the exception that it's not quite as critical, but there's still going to be a really inelastic demand. And for something that you don't need that often, but is really important, if a $5 or $10 bottle of acetaminophen, if they're gone from the store, people are going to spend $50 on it, because they're not going to have to do it constantly, and it'll be worth it to have it, especially as a fever reducer, people who need pain medication, stuff like that. So that's a big one. Another one is a lot of random toiletries. We have stuff like the little razor blades that work with, these are generics, but they'll work with the Mach 3 blades or whatever. And pretty much anything that has a small plastic components to it is going to be manufactured overseas. And these are great because people need them. Like I said, they're massively imported. The demand's going to be pretty inelastic because people don't spend that much money overall on it. So if something that's $10 is now $50, if you need it, it's still going to sell to somebody when there's none out there. And that goes for the handles, maybe even stuff like toothpaste. Just look around, any of the stuff that you need on a normal basis that people are going to have to buy no matter what. People just aren't going to stop using soap and shampoo and body wash and razors and everything unless stuff gets really, really bad. So they're going to be willing to pay a premium. So stock up on that stuff last minute, and go ahead and get the stuff that you use most of the time, and then you'll have dual purpose. You can use it, and the extras you can trade or sell or whatever. And last one's an interesting one that I thought of that isn't one that I've done personally because I don't have enough knowledge about it, but something like makeup. You think preppers are going to think like, you don't need makeup, and it's like, and that's true, but remember that I'm not talking about a full, shit the fan Mad Max meltdown. I'm just talking about major economic disruptions. And if you look in situations where people are in a very austere environment and deprived of outside resupply, what are the things that they go for? I'm specifically thinking of like in prison. Apparently makeup in women's prison is like a hugely sought after high value item. When you can't get it and women have their basic survival needs met, it's something that's very important to them. So I don't think that's going to change in this, war with Taiwan situation. Especially the better off America is, if we're just in that scenario where we're still pretty well off, but a lot of the stuff is just gone, people are going to be willing to spend a premium on the things like that they are used to doing day in, day out to look good, to feel good, whatever. So makeup is just one example. There's probably all sorts of other stuff like that and other items that would work for men. But just focus on the principles. Like I said, run over those one more time. Mostly imported, inelastic demand, small and inexpensive relatively, shelf stable, and mostly fungible. Something like a makeup color isn't totally fungible, but it can't be something insanely specific or else you're just going to have to sit on it for a while. So let me know what you guys think. I'm sure you guys can come up with some great examples of stuff that meets all those 5 requirements. And I recommend, of course, getting as much of this stuff as you can now, if it's stuff that you use already. But I definitely think there could be a huge moment of opportunity if there is a sudden escalation. Like all of a sudden, bam, there's war in China, Taiwan, or a blockade or something, it would be a great time to just snap up. Like if you could go out and spend $1,000 on these razors on Amazon, and then most of that stuff, even if nothing happened, worst case scenario is you either turn it back in or you sell it at basically what you paid for it, or wait a few months and it's a little bit more anyway, or you eventually use it. It's very unlikely that you would take a total bath on any of this stuff unless you chose your purchases poorly. But let me know what you guys think, because it's something I've been thinking about for a while, trying to write a list. So I figured I'd make a video about it, get the information out there to you guys, and also give you guys a chance to let me know if I'm missing anything. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.